The Gros Michel banana, the sweet, creamy fruit that built empires and defined a generation, was commercially extinct by 1960. It was a banana so ubiquitous, so ingrained in the global diet, that its sudden disappearance felt like a collective amnesia. Imagine a world where the apple you know vanished overnight, replaced by an entirely different fruit that merely shared its name. That's what happened with the banana. Your grandparents ate a banana that tasted different, looked different, and possessed a genetic vulnerability that brought an entire industry to its knees. This isn't just a story about a fruit. It's a cautionary tale about monoculture, human ingenuity, and the relentless march of nature. It's the hidden history behind the familiar yellow curve you hold in your hand today. A fruit engineered for survival, born from a desperate search, and carrying the genetic memory of a global catastrophe. We're going to uncover how a single plant nearly wiped out a multi-billion-dollar industry, forced a complete agricultural pivot, and fundamentally altered the taste of the world's most popular fruit. Before we peel back the layers of this fascinating history, I'm curious, which everyday food do you think has the most surprising hidden story? Let me know your guesses in the comments below. The banana your grandparents ate, the Gros Michel, wasn't just different, it was a revelation. Imagine a fruit whose flesh was like soft cream, almost melting on the tongue, with a sweetness that lingered, carrying notes of butterscotch and a perfume strong enough to fill a room. This wasn't a subtle difference, it was a profound shift in flavor and texture. A richness that the Cavendish, our modern banana, simply cannot replicate. But the Gros Michel's true secret, the one that built empires, wasn't just its taste, it was its skin. Thicker, tougher, more resilient than anything we know today, the Gros Michel's peel was a marvel of natural engineering. This robust outer layer meant it could endure weeks, sometimes months, at sea. It survived the rough handling of stevedores, the jostling of cargo holds, and the long, slow journeys from the tropics to distant markets without the need for refrigeration. This inherent durability was revolutionary. It allowed the nascent banana trade to flourish, connecting distant plantations to hungry consumers across continents, without the immense logistical and financial burden of chilled transport. Without that thick, forgiving skin, the concept of a global banana market might never have materialized. The Gros Michel didn't just taste better. Its very structure was the foundation upon which the entire industry was built, a silent partner in the creation of a global food phenomenon. Its resilience was its destiny until it wasn't. In 1904, the United Fruit Company, less than 5 years old, shipped over 12 million bunches of bananas, a scale that would have been unimaginable just decades prior. This wasn't just about selling fruit, it was about transforming landscapes and economies. They bought vast tracts of land, not just in Jamaica, but across Central America, Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala. Entire rainforests were cleared. Swamps were drained, plantations stretched for thousands of acres, green oceans of banana plants under the tropical sun. To move this perishable cargo, United Fruit built more than just farms. They constructed entire infrastructure networks. Miles of railway tracks snaked through dense jungles, connecting remote plantations to port cities. They built bridges, telegraph lines, and even power plants. In places like Limon, Costa Rica, and Puerto Barrios, Guatemala, towns sprung up almost overnight, populated by workers drawn to the promise of steady wages. These weren't just company towns. They were mini-states with United Fruit often owning the stores, the housing, and even the police forces. By the early 20th century, the company's fleet of steamships, famously known as the Great White Fleet, crisscrossed the Caribbean, carrying bananas north to eager American and European markets. These weren't slow cargo vessels. They were purpose-built, high-speed ships designed to deliver the fruit before it spoiled. The speed of these ships was critical, a logistical marvel that ensured ripe Gros Michel bananas arrived fresh on distant dinner tables. The scale was staggering. A single company, built on a single fruit, had become an economic and political powerhouse, shaping the destiny of entire nations. In 1904, American writer O. Henry coined the term banana republic. He used it to describe a fictional Central American nation, Anchuria, a country whose politics were manipulated by a U.S. corporation exporting bananas. This was not satire, it was a thinly veiled description of reality. One company, the United Fruit Company, held immense power. It controlled vast tracts of land, not just for growing bananas, but for the infrastructure to move them. United Fruit owned entire railway networks across Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. These weren't public lines, they were private arteries built to transport its fruit from inland plantations to coastal ports. The company also owned these ports. Puerto Barrios in Guatemala, Tela in Honduras, Limón in Costa Rica. These were, in effect, company towns built and operated by United Fruit. It controlled the docks, the warehouses, even the customs houses. This control extended to communications. United Fruit established its own telegraph and telephone lines. It built schools and hospitals, not out of pure philanthropy, but to ensure a stable, healthy workforce for its operations. Local governments often lack the resources or will to develop such infrastructure, so they relied on United Fruit. This created a dependency. The company negotiated favorable land concessions, often receiving land for free or at very low prices. In return, it promised development. These concessions frequently included exemptions from taxes. United Fruit became the largest employer in several countries. Its influence was so pervasive that it could dictate terms to national leaders. It could lobby the U.S. government to protect its interests, even suggesting military intervention if its assets were threatened. This extraordinary power, built on a single, perishable fruit, reshaped the political landscape of Central America. The Gros Michel banana, the very foundation of this empire, began to die in 1910, not in a spectacular, sudden blight, but in a slow, insidious strangulation, root by root, plant by plant. The culprit was a fungus, Fusarium oxysporum FEP cubans, known simply as Panama disease or Fusarium wilt, Race 1. This microscopic killer resided in the soil, an invisible threat lurking beneath the fertile earth. It didn't attack the leaves or the fruit directly. Instead, it infiltrated the banana plant's roots, blocking its vascular system. Imagine a living plant slowly choking from the inside out, unable to draw water or nutrients. The leaves would yellow, then wilt, and within months, the entire plant would collapse, rotting into the soil. There was no cure. Once a patch of land was infected, it was poisoned for decades, rendering it useless for future banana cultivation. The spores could persist in the soil for 30 years or more. This meant that once a plantation was hit, it was a death sentence. The disease spread through contaminated soil on workers' boots, on farm tools, in floodwaters, even on the tires of company vehicles. From one sick plant, it would creep outwards, claiming entire fields, then entire plantations. United Fruit, despite its immense resources and scientific expertise, was helpless. They watched as their vast, carefully cultivated Gros Michel groves began to disappear, first in Panama, then Costa Rica, Colombia, and Ecuador. The unstoppable advance of Panama disease was not just an agricultural problem, it was an existential threat to the entire banana industry. Their only recourse was to abandon infected land and clear new forests, an unsustainable, destructive cycle that bought them time, but offered no solution. The banana your grandparents ate tasted nothing like the one you're holding right now. In fact, that familiar, slightly artificial banana flavor in candy and artificial additives isn't wrong at all. It's a perfect sonic ghost of a fruit that vanished. When confectioners and food scientists first sought to replicate banana flavor, they weren't tasting the Cavendish. They were matching the Gros Michel, the chemical compound responsible for that iconic taste, isoamyl acetate, was precisely calibrated to the sweet, almost creamy notes of the banana that dominated the market for over a century. So, when you bite into a banana Laffy Taffy or sip a banana Runts-flavored milkshake and think, this doesn't taste like a real banana, you are experiencing a historical echo. You are tasting the ghost of the Gros Michel, a flavor profile so deeply embedded in our collective memory of banana that its artificial recreation outlasted the fruit itself. It's a culinary paradox. The artificial taste is actually the authentic one for a generation past. This flavor, now dismissed as synthetic and wrong by modern palates, was once the very essence of banana for millions across the globe. It's a delicious, unsettling reminder of how quickly our sensory landscape can shift and how a market-driven extinction can leave behind an indelible, albeit ersatz, legacy. The candy aisle, then, became an accidental archive, preserving a taste that agriculture could not. The banana your grandparents knew vanished, replaced by a tougher, blander imposter. The Cavendish. This wasn't an upgrade. It was a compromise, a desperate pivot after Panama disease annihilated the Gros Michel. The Cavendish was thin-skinned, needed careful handling, and crucially, ripened far more slowly. This last trait was its saving grace. It meant the fruit could survive weeks at sea, enduring the long voyages from distant plantations. The industry scrambled to adapt. New refrigerated ships, a marvel of early 20th century engineering, became standard. Shipping routes were redesigned. Entire port infrastructures had to be reconfigured, with specialized cranes and climate-controlled warehouses to handle the delicate new cargo. Banana workers learned new packing techniques, each bunch wrapped and cushioned with a precision previously unknown. The Cavendish wouldn't tolerate the rough-and-tumble journey the Gros Michel had, so the entire logistical chain, from jungle to grocery store, was rebuilt around its specific vulnerabilities. Suddenly, the banana became less about intense flavor and more about durability and shelf life. Consumers initially were disappointed. The rich, almost custardy sweetness of the Gros Michel was gone, replaced by a milder, firmer flesh. But as the 1960s rolled into the 70s, and the memory of the Gros Michel faded, the Cavendish became the default. Its ubiquity cemented its status, transforming a second-choice fruit into a global staple. It was a testament to human ingenuity and market power that an entire agricultural empire could shift its bedrock species in a single generation. This new banana era, however, carried with it a silent, inherent risk, a monoculture built on a single genetic lifeline, inviting the next catastrophe. The Cavendish banana you just ate is a clone. Every single one. From the plantations of Ecuador to the grocery store aisle, every Cavendish banana on Earth is genetically identical. They are, quite literally, the same plant reproduced endlessly. This genetic uniformity, while efficient for industrial-scale farming, is the Achilles heel of the entire global banana trade. It means that if one Cavendish plant is susceptible to a disease, every Cavendish plant is susceptible. There's no genetic diversity, no random mutation in the wild population that might offer resistance. It's a vast global field of identical targets. This fatal design has already proven disastrous. In the 1990s, a new, more virulent strain of Fusarium wilt, dubbed Tropical Race 4 or TR4, emerged in Malaysia. Unlike its predecessor, TR1, which decimated the Gros Michel, TR4 can infect and kill the Cavendish. Because every Cavendish is a clone, TR4 doesn't need to evolve to overcome different genetic defenses. It encounters the exact same vulnerability every single time. It spreads through soil, water, and even on the boots of farm workers, rendering land infertile for banana cultivation for decades. Today, TR4 has spread to Asia, Africa, and most recently, South America, the very heart of Cavendish production. The industry is in a race against time, desperately searching for a new banana or a solution, before this silent killer achieves what Panama disease did to the Gros Michel and what its own design invites, another global banana extinction event. The replacement for the Cavendish banana could be growing in a laboratory right now. Researchers are working tirelessly, but the task is far more complex than simply finding another tasty fruit. The challenge lies in the banana's very nature. It is seedless. This convenience, bred into the Cavendish for consumers, is also its greatest vulnerability. Without seeds, traditional breeding methods are impossible. You can't cross-pollinate a Cavendish with a wild, disease-resistant variety and select for the best traits over generations. Instead, scientists rely on painstaking tissue culture, genetic screening, and increasingly, gene editing. In the Philippines, Australia, and Honduras, dedicated teams are racing against TR4. Projects like the Banana 21 initiative in Queensland are exploring gene-edited Cavendish varieties. They've managed to insert genes from a wild banana, making some Cavendish lines significantly more resistant to TR4 in trials. This isn't a new banana, but a fortified Cavendish, a genetic upgrade. Another approach focuses on identifying existing naturally resistant banana varieties, often obscure, local fruits, and attempting to adapt them for global production. But even a resistant Cavendish or a promising new candidate faces monumental hurdles. It needs to grow well in diverse climates, ripen consistently, survive shipping across oceans, and crucially taste exactly right. Consumers expect the Cavendish experience. Perfectly yellow, sweet, and blemish-free. Introducing a new banana means retraining an entire global supply chain, convincing farmers to plant it, and persuading billions of eaters to accept a new flavor and texture. It's a logistical and agricultural Everest, and the clock is ticking faster every day. In 2019, Tropical Race 4, or TR4, breached its containment, crossing oceans and continents, appearing in Latin America, the last stronghold of the Cavendish. It had already ravaged Asia, Africa, and Australia. TR4 isn't a fungus that attacks the banana plant directly. It's a soil-borne pathogen. It can linger in the ground for decades, rendering vast tracts of land permanently unsuitable for Cavendish cultivation. There's no chemical treatment. There is no cure. This time, there is no replacement ready. No miracle banana waiting in the wings to save our global monoculture. Decades of research have yielded promising candidates, but none possess the Cavendish's combination of hardiness, storability, and mass appeal. The challenges are immense. A new banana must thrive in diverse climates, resist bruising during shipping, ripen uniformly, and most importantly, taste familiar enough to a world accustomed to the Cavendish. The clock is not just ticking, it's accelerating. Every year, more land becomes unusable, more harvests are lost. Scientists race against an invisible enemy, but the solutions are complex and slow. Developing a new resistant variety takes years of breeding and testing. Scaling up production to meet global demand is another monumental hurdle. Convincing billions of consumers to accept a new taste and texture after generations of Cavendish might be the hardest part of all. So, the next time you peel that perfectly curved, yellow fruit, remember its precarious existence. The banana in your kitchen today is the last of its kind, living on borrowed time. Its future, and the future of an industry built upon it, hangs by a thread. The history of the banana is a story of ingenuity, vulnerability, and the relentless march of nature. And it is far from over.